Soha Saad was a 24-year-old woman who lived in Fullerö, a town located north of Uppsala in Sweden. She recently got her teaching diploma from university and was hoping to find a job as a teacher. Her family and friends describe her as kind, full of dreams, who always look after her family and loved ones. Soha tragically died after an explosion in her neighborhood on the 28th of September of this year. Her death left her loved ones overwhelmed by grief and pain, and a whole community shocked and upset. The blast that killed Soha also destroyed 5 houses. Soha Saad is one of the many innocent victims claimed by the wave of gang related violence that shook Sweden in the month of September and that has been present in the country in the past few years. Sweden has seen an increase in gang related crime because several rival groups are fighting each other for control. Compared to most countries in the world, Sweden is still a safe country. However, when it comes to shootings, Sweden is one of the highest in Europe. But why is this happening? Where is this coming from? The answer? It has to do more with systemic issues, especially because these horrible criminal groups groom children for them to join the gangs and do their dirty work, trapping children as young as 10 years of age. Just a quick note, even though they don't use the exact same tactics, we can see a few similarities with how Nazis and other far-right groups groom boys, especially when it comes to using toxic masculinity. And there has also been an increase in far-right violence in Sweden, in some instances even among themselves. For example, the 2nd of October of this year, the house of Billy Linder was bombed in Hässelby in Stockholm, and he's a neo-Nazi and former member of the Nordic resistance movement and is now in police custody as the main suspect of a shooting in Örebro where someone died. How the far-right grooms children is just a topic for another episode. Today I want to focus on this topic. How do criminal gangs groom and recruit children? According to the British child protection charity National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, or NSPCC, organized criminal gangs groom children and young people because they're less suspicious and are given lighter sentences than adults. NSPCC research explains that children join gangs because they seen it as the only option they have. Schools exclude them and they feel they have no future other than to join a gang. They feel like they need protection from other gangs, that they need protection from the police and also from bullies. They also feel like this is the only way they can get money and feel respected and listen. They also are threatened by the gangs to join them, and a lot of kids also are victims of human trafficking for the purpose of criminal exploitation. Even though toxic masculinity is a key part of criminal gangs' culture and grooming, crime is a consequence of social inequality. Most of the children who join them come from vulnerable situations which are intensified and or even created by social inequality, systemic racism, and xenophobia, among other systems of oppression and exclusion. Now we're going to talk about social inequality and poverty. To understand how social inequality affects children of color, we need to talk about vulnerable areas in Sweden. Vulnerable areas in Sweden are areas that are inhabited by people with weak financial resources, often with an immigrant background or in social exclusion situations. The Swedish police has an official registry of those areas, and I know that it is weird and problematic that the police is in charge of such registry. These areas, which are often at the outskirts of the city, were created during the Million Program, or the Million Program in English, which was a large public housing program in Sweden from 1965 to 1974 by the Social Democrats, where they successfully built 1 million new housing which were affordable and they were high quality. Since the beginning, this project was criticized by Swedish conservatives, especially because back then those who lived there were white working class people, including those who came from Finland. Nowadays, most of the population is of migrant background, mostly because of white flight and also a lot of these white working class people. They just went up the class ladder thanks to opportunities they got because of free education and other circumstances. Keep in mind that what Swedish society refers to as migrants not wanting to integrate is more about cities like Stockholm and Göteborg being very segregated, but we will talk more about it in this episode, I promise. An example of how systemic the destruction of migrant communities is, we need to talk about what's happening in Järva, which is a district area in the north of Stockholm. So, part of Järva are Rinkeby, Husby, Tensta, and Hjulsta, which were built during the Miljon Program and are considered vulnerable areas. Community services in the Järva region have disappeared in the past decades, including thousands of jobs in those areas. More than 70% of all the community centers have disappeared from Husby alone since the 70s. Some of the services that have been shut down and some of the buildings that have been sold to private companies are intense. That we have retirement home, service apartments for elderly people, Rose Tensta High School, dentist, national liquor store, drug addiction clinic, district administration, community centers, and 3 elementary schools. In Rinkeby, the places that have been closed down have been community center, post office, bank, employment services, district administration, social insurance office, family center, elementary school, assembly rooms, community police, which is local police embedded in the community. And now what they have instead is like this huge fortress style police station. In Husby, the local government shut down the assembly rooms, elementary school, public health center, community center, and youth center. In Akala, the local government shut down the community center and the library, and in Justa, the government shut down the youth center. Last year, Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson, which by the way is what happens if a far-right wet towel could talk, promised 250 million Swedish crowns, which is more than $22 million, to sports association in vulnerable areas. Today, that promise of a grant was not only reduced to 100 million Swedish crowns, which is 9 million US dollars, but also there's no money. And when the local sports coach asked where the money is, they just got no answer. In these areas, services like healthcare and education are often lower quality or have much less funding than in areas with a white majority. And this problem has gotten worse due to privatization of healthcare services and education. So in Sweden, there are charter schools, and the privatization of healthcare works similar to the charter school system. Like patients get a set amount that they bring where they visit a healthcare center, which they can go to privately run clinic and doctors, and these private companies running healthcare centers and clinics get their profit from taxpayers' money. I know it's really, really messed up. And it has gotten to the point that even criminal gangs are running healthcare centers in Sweden. And the profit from this and other similar operations, including welfare fraud, is estimated to be almost 6 billion Swedish crowns, which is more than $500 million US dollars, which is more than twice the amount of profit these criminal groups get from the drug trafficking business. Now let's talk about systemic racism, migration policies, and the police. Racism is part of the fabric of Swedish society and history, from the kingdom's participation in the global colonial project to the long and recent history of racial biology and destruction of Roma and Sami communities in the country. To talk about racism in Swedish society is very hard, but we need to talk about it. In the report Folkets Husby Safety Investigation 2022 Community Perspectives on Crime, when asked if people in my neighborhood are limited by racism, more than 80% answer that yes, one way or another. In the same report, when asked where they have experienced racism. The top places were at work or when looking for a job, at school, with the police, in healthcare and social services, when looking for housing, in public spaces, and in public transport. In the report, it's concluded that since racism affects the residents' collective ability to mobilize in a constructive direction, it is fundamental to map the different forms of racism, but also to examine how groups within Yarba are affected in different ways. And other investigations in the topic of racism in Sweden, they bring similar results. According to a survey conducted by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, Sweden is among the top 10 countries in Europe where there's more perceived racist violence against people of African descent. The United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner in 2022 reported that Sweden needs to step up efforts to fight systemic racism in the country. According to the report, ethnic minorities and non-white people in Sweden face discrimination in the labor market, housing, and education, which considerably affect their quality of life in the country. The 2022 UN report also pointed out that hate crimes remain very high in the country, the majority being xenophobia and racism. The Commission also noted that there's a clear failure to effectively address these crimes because of neglect. Therefore, most people don't report them. This might have to do with the fact that the Swedish National Police is the one in charge to fight hate crimes. I know, the irony. And also in Sweden, hate crimes are defined on the basis of the perpetrator's motive, that is, attitudes and opinions, rather than on objective criteria. When it comes to police and racism, the United Nations experts in the 2022 report noted that we heard that most of the population in Sweden generally has a confidence in the police, yet most of the testimonies we received from members of racialized communities spoke of fear of an oppressive police presence, racial profiling, and arbitrary stops and searches. In the 2022 report, Folkhälsohusby Safety Information Community Perspectives on Crime, done with adults 30 years old and younger that live in Järva, Stockholm, reveal the following. 62% of those who have been stopped by the police in the past 12 months, both parents were from Africa. 12% said that the police provides good support when a serious act of violence happened in the community. More than 70% think that authorities in the area don't do a good job working in preventing children from joining criminal groups. Those who were stopped by the police, 59% were told to stop filming the police, 55% had their cars searched, 54% were forcefully restrained, 63% were body searched, and 33% were taken to the police station. Only 9% receive a valid reason every time they were stopped by the police. More than 50% think the police is not good at solving and preventing crime, not trusting them, and think they're not helpful. Keep in mind when reading and listening these statistics, in Sweden there are no statistics based on race. So since that piece of information is missing, we can't get the whole picture. However, we can get an idea with the current parameters we're using. And the thing is, like, the Swedish police is quick to blame those from those vulnerable areas for not trusting them, but why would they? Why would people who live in these areas trust the police? Like, they even harass those who are leaders in the community and those who even work in projects that are meant to fight gang violence and make the community better. We have the case of Said Ali, who is a teacher and a football coach that is part of a night football club for young boys in Järva, and an amateur photographer. In 2021, he has been stopped by the police several times under different excuses. One time he was dragged out of the car because he supposedly didn't have his seatbelt on, and the police wasn't capable of proving that. One time Said had his camera taken by the police for no reason, and some of the times that Said has been harassed by the Swedish police, it has been in front of the children who go to the football club. In 2020, the Swedish police raided an art gallery in Tensta during a meeting organized by the gallery with residents in the area after having sent an open letter to local politicians about the shutting down services and schools in Tensta. Without an explanation, the police showed up with dogs, searched the gallery, threatened the visitors, body searched them, and took their personal information. The police found nothing, of course, and when journalists reached them with questions about this raid, the police just ignored them. Mustafa Satara, one of the workers in the art gallery in Tensta, described how the police forced him to take his clothes off and that this is not the first time the police had harassed him. Early this year, the police demanded a list of all the Mongolian students, including their social security numbers and home addresses, from the high school Estetiska Gymnasium in Farsta, Stockholm. When Annika Hedas Falk, the principal of the high school, refused to do it, the police then said that they will search the school anyways. The Swedish police has a good reputation internationally because A, when it comes to police abuses and brutality, the bar is in hell, and we know there are countries that are much, much worse. And B, Swedes are good at PR, and also your perception about the Swedish police depends on who you are. Of course, most of white people in Sweden feel comfortable and safe when it comes to their interactions with the Swedish police, but that's not the reality of everybody who lives in Sweden. All the resources that are taken away from these communities ended up in the hands of the Swedish police and private corporations. And as the evidence shows, this doesn't help to resolve the gang violence and the crime. On the contrary, if I have to say, it makes it worse. Now, let's talk about migration. Resignation syndrome is a catatonic condition that induces a state of reduced consciousness, first described in Sweden in the 1990s. The condition affects mostly psychologically traumatized children and adolescents in the midst of a very lengthy and stressful migration process. In an article about the condition published in the New Yorker, where the reporter met with families whose children have the resignation syndrome, it states, the patients have no underlying physical or neurological disease, but they seem to have lost the will to live. By 2005, more than 400 children, most between the ages of 8 and 15, had fallen into the condition. In the medical journal Acta Pediatrica, Bodegord described the typical patient as totally passive, immobile, lack tonus, withdrawn, mute, unable to eat and drink, incontinent, and not reacting to physical stimuli or pain. Imagine having migration laws so cruel that they're triggering illness in children and even putting them in vulnerable and dangerous situations. Just imagine. Hundreds of refugee children have been deported from Sweden. There have been cases. Hundreds of refugee children have been deported from Sweden. There have even been cases of children as young as few months old who have received deportation orders without their parents. Thousands of children have disappeared in the Swedish asylum process in the last few years, and the government seems to do nothing to address that problem. And I'm sorry, I have re-recorded this part so many times because I can't talk about this part without feeling emotional, because this is too much, and I wanna be hopeful and hope those kids are safe, even though statistics and and data and research says otherwise. But I can't record this part without crying. But this is important, and I want you to know this. I want you to at least to know this is how. I'm gonna take a quick break. I'm just gonna take a quick break. Since the discussion about racism in Swedish society as a historical and systemic reality is often censored and is a huge taboo, it becomes a self fulfilling prophecy because they remove this important part of information from the discussion. So, what they do is they blame non white people for not integrating in Swedish society. And on top of that, they keep punishing these communities because they don't want to integrate. And the thing is, like, the whole Swedish integration thing, which I completely disagree with, is based on the all white supremacist tradition of pretty much wanting to have communities disappear, like how Sweden did to like minorities in Sweden, like the Sami, the Roma, and the Jewish community. And the thing is, like, to this day, there are politicians that refer to those communities as non-Swedes, especially like the far-right party Sverigedemokraterna, who comes from the Nazi movement in the 90s. It could take hours if we decide to discuss the ways different Swedish political parties have normalized racism in Swedish society just in the past few years, and even made bigotry the core discourse of their political parties. Let's start talking about the far right parties, Sverigedemokraterna or the Sweden Democrats. They have, for example, done like these anti-Semitic and racist references when they cover some of the subway wagons here in Stockholm during last elections, and have always had a very open xenophobic discourse. And to talk about the history of Sverigedemokraterna, it could take hours, but just quickly, I'm going to tell you that this party comes from the Swedish Nazi movement in the 90s and is full of Nazis. So we have Moderaterna, or the moderates. They're not moderates at all, even though their name says otherwise. So they form a government with Liberalerna and Kristdemokraterna, and they work in collaboration with Sverigedemokraterna, or the Sweden Democrats. And they have created extremely evil policies, not only against the working class, but especially against migrants and refugees. And some of these laws that they want to implement, and they might and will most likely, are like wanting to force institutions like hospitals, healthcare centers, and even schools and daycares to report people they might suspect as undocumented migrants. They also want to have the police randomly stop people in migrant majority areas, and they just approve the creation of detention centers for asylum seekers. Yes, as you heard it, they just approved that, and they're going to build them soon. The Social Democrats and Swedish social democracy is not the exception. A lot of massive deportations and very horrible anti-migrant rules started with them. The party openly blamed immigrants for the erosion of workers' rights in Sweden, and the party leader Magdalena Andersson has said a lot of racist things, including that one time she said that she's against the creation of Somali towns. You know what I mean? Swedish social democracy aspiration is to apply the Danish model of social democracy in Sweden. And if you don't know how the Danish model of social democracy is currently, I recommend you to Google it. And I talk a little about it in an episode I did a few years ago about white feminism. So I'm going to include that video in the comments section and in the description of this episode, but I strongly recommend you to check it out. Okay, this is a quick parenthesis that I'm doing in this episode for two reasons. First, because while I was editing this episode, I just got new information about the topic that I'm talking about that I want to discuss very briefly. And the second, because there was something very positive that I forgot to mention. And I want to start talking about the positive thing that I forgot to mention in this episode. And I think it's really amazing and you should know about. So there's this group called Nadvandrande Mammor, or roughly translated to English like night walking mothers, and it's also like fathers as well. So it's this groups, self-organizing groups that are around Stockholm. I think they have them in Göteborg and in Malmö. So what they do is it's just a group of adults and parents mostly that they go out, especially in the weekends, from 10 p.m. till 2, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., just to walk around. It's not neighbors watch at all. It's just, go to places where would usually kids hang out at those times of the night and talk to them, make them feel safe, make them feel like, hey, if there's something you want to talk about, if there's something that's happening, here there's an adult that's going to listen to you. Mind you, it's completely self-organizing. They receive no fundings from the government or the local governments. It's completely based, volunteers based, I mean, and they go out with no weapons, not even pepper spray, because in Sweden, pepper sprays are illegal to carry. They really, really do a really good job, and it has prevented a lot of kids from joining criminal activities or just doing wrong things. And I just wanted to talk about it. And that's something that makes me feel so proud of living in Sweden and being an immigrant in Sweden. So check it out. There is a documentary that Al Jazeera did about it. It's a little dramatic, it exaggerates a little about how these areas are, because they have to do the whole, filter and editing and things like that. But it's a really good documentary nonetheless, in the sense that I think it shows the most honest portrayal that you can find of these groups outside of Swedish media. If you don't speak Swedish, I recommend it to you. If you speak Swedish, I'm going to include some articles in the episode's description about them. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about in this parenthesis that is part of the latest development, I don't want to talk that much about gang violence and criminal groups in Sweden, because then this episode would be like hours long, and this episode is not about that. This episode is about discussing the causes of why kids end up in criminal gangs and how we can prevent it. And to be honest, I am giving you an analysis that no one is going to give you, going back to the information that I found out. So the latest wave of violence is related with this gang that is called Foxtrot, and the leader, his name is Rawa Mayids. So it seems like the police have known about this gang for years, and they said that, oh, we just didn't think it was that serious. The chief of police even went and gave an interview last week about it and all those things. But also it seems like according to Swedish press, and I'm going to say this one last time, according to Swedish press, I don't want to get sued, please. It seems like it's more serious than what we thought, because it seems like there's been like leaks to the criminal gangs from the police. It seems like the gangs have infiltrated the police. So it's actually deeper than what we think it is. And as I mentioned before, this gang, Foxtrot, and they called the leader Rawa Mayids. They called him, I think, in Iran. And it seems like his operation, remember how in the episode I talk about how these gangs also have like operations related with like healthcare centers, and they do fraud in those operations and things like that, and also they run healthcare centers and also like social services. It seems like his organization, the Rawa Mayids Foxtrot criminal gang, they also have like businesses in like social services, and including like this company in charge of like rehoming foster care children and things like that. So this was something I wanted to talk about very, very briefly in this parenthesis, and I found out about it while I was working editing this episode. I just tried to like stick it right in the episode. In Sweden, there's not a problem of integration, but a problem of segregation, which is done with racism, targeting communities, and defunding services in areas where the majority are of a foreign background. As I mentioned before, crime is a consequence of social inequality, poverty, racist policies, and segregation. Stockholm is a very segregated society, and for decades the government has targeted migrants, Black and POC communities, defunding services, and just sending more police who abuse their power and harass Black and POC children. The violent cycle that these children are trapped in started with how Sweden, together with other European and Western countries from the global north, have made a profit by destroying and exploiting the countries these people and their parents are running from in the first place. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire explained that the humanization, although concrete historical fact, is not a given destiny but the result of an unjust order that engenders violence in the oppressors, which in turn dehumanizes the oppressed. These children are trapped in a cycle of dehumanization, destruction of communities, and institutional racism, which makes them vulnerable to the grooming of these horrible criminal enterprises. The violence is killing our children and destroying our communities, leaving us saddened and hopeless. In the middle of all of this, our children are dying, falling in the claws of organized gangs which groom them, and communities are suffering. At the end of the day, those who live in these communities are just normal people who mind their business and want to live in peace. These communities are diverse with amazing public spaces where everybody is welcome, where people are working very hard to build a life for themselves and their loved ones. There are a lot of amazing initiatives going on that are bringing positive change. Then, why take resources and agency away from them? If we believe in a better Sweden and want to protect our communities, we need to have this conversation. Critical thinking with facts and research, and try to engage locally the best we can. If we love our communities and if we love Sweden, we must be able to have these conversations. This is my country too, and I also want to help. And for me to help is to have conversations that might make some uncomfortable, but in the end will bring positive change. You might be wondering, why do this episode in English? I want to have this conversation in English because often the discussion about Sweden and Europe in general, when it comes to crime and migrant communities, is full of lies, even when it comes from liberal and progressive English speaking media. How many more innocent people must die before we accept the real solution for this problem? Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, to comment, and share. Tell me what you think in the comment sections. And who knows, maybe I will do a video answering your questions if you have any questions. This episode has been the episode I've worked the hardest for, and it has been the most emotionally taxing episode I've ever made. And I did it with a lot of love, and I hope you guys find this episode helpful. I will include, as always, all of my sources in the episode description, and I'm also going to include links of some organizations that you can follow. And if you want to get more information, even if they're in the Swedish, but if you want to, feel free to follow them. And I want to thank all of the people in Sweden who are working very, very hard every day to not only collect information, but also to fight this problem. So thank you as well. I also want to thank my patrons. Thank you so much for your support. I will have extra content on Patreon as well, connected with this episode. You can find me on YouTube, and you can find me on most podcast platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I'm also on social media, Instagram and TikTok. And I also have my official website, mangopodcast.com. Thank you so much once again for listening. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please support this project. And this is Mango Podcast. Thank you.